Thermal cameras, what are they and should you have one? I didn't, but now I do. So let's look at what they might be useful for. Hi, I'm Gary. I make videos about technology that interests me, mostly from an ordinary user point of view. I've just returned from a month-long vacation, where I acquired a new gee-whiz gadget. This is the Topdon TC001, which attaches to a phone through its USB-C connector, like this, and it becomes a full-fledged thermal camera. I think it deserves to be the subject of at least a quick video. Now, you may remember that I said in one of my earlier videos that I don't buy things just to talk about them on YouTube. So what's the point of this rather exotic gizmo? Well, first off, I didn't buy this. It was a gift, and an unexpected one at that. And my first reaction was, wow, that's really cool. But what do I need it for? And you might be justified in asking the same question. The answer to that is a work in progress, but I can give you at least some possible answers. Let's start with what it isn't good for. To start with, it certainly isn't useful to make videos of yourself for YouTube, unless you're just into being weird. I did this clip purely for the fun of it. A thermal camera basically measures the surface temperature of whatever you point it at. So you can't do that spy movie thing of detecting somebody moving on the other side of a solid wall. And you can't measure whether your Thanksgiving turkey is baked yet or not. All it could tell you is how hot it is on the outside. It also can't really measure air temperature, other than as it heats up objects. However, there are a lot of potential uses for a device like this. They're widely used in industrial applications, usually for detecting when things are getting hotter than they should be, or when something that should be at a uniform temperature is not. There are similar medical uses like that as well. And of course, you've probably seen TV footage of police or military helicopters detecting someone on the ground hiding in the dark. If you're interested, I have included a link in the description to a web page that lists 65 possible uses of a thermal camera, most of which actually are uses. But I'm just plain old Joe consumer, so why would I want one? Other than it's a really neat toy, particularly for an engineer. As it happens, I stumbled across a use for it only days after I received it. So I'll give you a real example in a minute. First, let me give you an oversimplified explanation of how this thing works. It's basically a camera, just like the one in your phone, except that the sensor in it only responds to infrared light. It's a contradiction to refer to it as light, of course, because it's completely outside the range of visible light, but never mind. Its spectral range is 8 to 14 micrometers, which is a range of wavelengths about 10 times longer than the visible spectrum in the so-called mid-infrared region. The radiation that's emitted or reflected from an object in this range is essentially determined by its temperature. So the camera maps the output from each pixel in its sensor to a color that depends on the temperature of what's being imaged, and then shows this false color image on its display, which in this case is my phone's screen. One of the neat things about it is that it doesn't depend on visible light at all. For example, here are two images of my hot water heater, one taken with the lights on and the other in total darkness. They're essentially identical. You'll notice there are some temperature values showing in the picture. One is the temperature in the center of the image, so you can always get a reading from whatever you pointed at. The other two are the hottest and coldest temperatures found in the imaging area. And the scale on the right shows how colors have been mapped to this range of temperatures. It automatically rescales this temperature range to match the image, although you can set this manually if you want to, and you can change the color mapping as well. You can superimpose the phone camera image on it. You can also define specific spots or areas of the image to be monitored or recorded or even graphed over time if you want to set it up in a fixed position, for example. I haven't done much with these features as yet, other than to try it on my kitchen stovetop. You can obviously tell that the resolution of the images is pretty low. 256 by 192 pixels to be exact. This is because the sensors are expensive and they require a lot of processing power, and consumer-level devices like this don't really require high resolution for their intended purposes. Which brings me back to the question, what possible use can I make of this gizmo? To put my little case study in context, I was visiting family down south this past month. My sister and brother-in-law have a couple of cabins in the hills of central Arkansas, which are completely off-grid. They have a fairly large solar array and 30 kilowatt hours of lithium iron phosphate batteries to provide power for the heat pump, air conditioning, and heating units. That big Arctic cold wave in mid-January brought temperatures in the area down below 10 degrees Fahrenheit at one point, and lithium iron phosphate batteries will be damaged if you try to charge them below freezing. This wouldn't have been a problem, except that there was also no sunshine during this period to provide solar power for running the heat pumps, so the batteries were running down and it was getting cold. We brought in small propane heaters to keep the cabins above freezing for about a week. Both cabins have temperature monitors that we checked on over the internet, and one of the things we noticed is that the cabin where the batteries are stayed 4 to 5 degrees warmer than the other one. The two cabins are almost identical in construction, and it didn't seem likely that the 100 watts or so of standby power in the solar inverters was having that big an effect in a 3,000 cubic foot room. So when we went up to check on things, I brought along my new thermal camera and did a quick and dirty heat loss survey. Everything looked pretty similar for the walls and around the doors and windows, which are identical in the two cabins. There was a difference in the ceilings because one cabin has a drop ceiling and the other doesn't. But we also had begun to suspect the floors, and sure enough, the floor in the one cabin was about 4 degrees warmer than the other one. That cabin has about a half-inch of foil-covered bubble wrap stapled underneath the floor, and the other one doesn't. That little bit of insulation was enough to make a significant difference, which obviously provides an incentive to better insulate the other cabin as well. Finding heat loss spots in a building is in fact one of the most common uses for thermal cameras. When I came home, I started surveying my own house. Because we replaced all our windows some years ago with more efficient ones, I haven't found any obvious spots that we could improve, except for perhaps our front door, which is paneled wood and a tiny bit leaky under the bottom. The panels are thin at the edges, so a solid door would certainly lose less heat. I'll mention one other possible use for a thermal camera that might apply to a lot of people. They're commonly used for looking for hot spots in electrical systems. You're probably aware that a bad connection in a heavily loaded electrical circuit gets hot. In fact, that was the source of a number of home fires involving aluminum wiring in the 1960s and 70s. Even today, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission estimates that homes with aluminum wiring are like 55 times more likely to have an electrical connection reach fire hazard conditions than those with copper wiring. A thermal camera can help you look for those kinds of hazards, particularly if you remove outlet covers and such like, so you can see the actual connections. I don't have aluminum wiring, but my house and its wiring, including the circuit breakers, is almost 50 years old, and not to mention I wired it myself. I did do a quick scan of my electrical panels with the cover still on, and didn't see any breakers that show signs of overheating. I'll probably take the panel covers off and check for hot spots in the connections to the breakers as well. But hopefully all I get out of doing this will be some peace of mind. I scanned my hot water heater just to get some idea of how much heat it was losing. Turned out to be not much, and since we heat our basement in the winter anyway, it isn't actually lost heat. And just for fun, I ran the hot water in a bathroom sink to see how long it took and how close it got to the hot water heater thermostat setting. Meanwhile, the water heater outlet pipe stayed surprisingly cool. That's about as far as I've gone with the thermal camera to date. I will leave a link in the video description to my Android version, which also works on a Windows PC, and also to the iOS version. Hopefully you found this interesting or maybe even educational. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like for the video, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so. If you have other ideas for using a thermal camera or questions about it, feel free to leave them in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.